Hi, I'm Emily Thorson. I am a political scientist, and I'm going to talk a bit about my own research on misinformation, but I want to start by taking a step back and talking about a question I think is really critical if we are here, as we are, to design really practical interventions for misinformation. And that is, when does misinformation matter? And this question is important partly because I think our intuition on this is often really wrong. I think our intuition is that there's a lot of people walking around like this, right? Who think, I'm not really sure who I'm going to vote for. I don't know why Barack Obama is green in this, but maybe I like Obama, maybe I like Romney. I'm not so sure. What should I do? And then in comes misinformation, and this person says, well, wow, Obama's a Muslim. Don't like that at all. I guess I'll vote for Romney. So the concern, I think the intuitive concern that we have often is that misinformation is causing people to behave in ways that are different than the ways they would behave if they were fully informed. But in the real world, there's not a lot of political blank slates walking around out there, right? We know that most people have a party identification. Most people, even the ones who identify as independent, actually are Democrats or Republicans in disguise. Most people have policy preferences, right? And these attitudes and these policy preferences shape what information they consume, what information they believe, and what information they actually use to shape their attitudes and their behavior. So this process is really important, and so I'm going to put it in big, giant letters, and that is motivated reasoning. Almost all of you have probably heard this term before, but it's important enough that I want to go into it again. Motivated reasoning, right? Whenever we encounter a new piece of information, we have two competing drives. We want to be right. This is the accuracy drive. But we also want to be consistent. We want our what we believe to be consistent with how we feel. And this is the directional drive. And this directional drive is incredibly powerful, especially when it comes to politics. And what that means is that our pre-existing political attitudes, including our party identification, enormously shape what we seek out, what we believe, what we remember, and what we use to actually inform our opinions. So I think, again, intuitively, we often think, well, people's factual beliefs, that's what matters for their attitudes. But in reality, we know from a whole lot of social science research that the arrow often points in the other direction, that our attitudes exert an enormous influence on what facts we actually believe. Of course, it's always more complicated than that. It's going to vary by context and by person. But given this, I think, again, it's really important to then ask the question again, when does misinformation matter? When does it actually change people's attitudes to cause them to hold beliefs that they wouldn't otherwise hold? So one time it matters, when it is repeated. So I want you to think about the last time or the first time you heard that Donald Trump said the murder rate is the highest it was in 47 years, which is, of course, false. It probably was not because you were at the sheriff's conference where he said this. It was because you saw it in a tweet like this, or a tweet from one of your friends, right? But even when misinformation is, you encounter misinformation in the process of it being corrected, it still can influence your attitudes. So even if you see this and you know that it's not true that the murder rate is the highest it's been in 47 years, it still exerts an influence on your attitudes. And these are called belief echoes. Right? That when you encounter a piece of information, it has an immediate, unconscious effect on your attitudes, and a correction, even if you believe the correction, does not entirely erase that effect. And so it's really important, I think, not to repeat misinformation, even if it is for the noble purpose of correcting it sometimes, because even if we do everything right, if we design the perfect correction that everyone believes, misinformation can continue to exert this kind of unconscious influence on our attitudes. Second time misinformation matters, when pre-existing attitudes are weak. So let's go back to our little stick figure. Anyone know who these people are? Many of you cast a ballot for one of them. This is our candidates for the Massachusetts Governor's Council, right? No one knows about this race. But what that means is that any given piece of information in this race is going to have a much larger effect on people's attitudes. So misinformation is going to matter a lot more in this situation because people's directional motivations, their pre-existing attitudes, are much weaker. It's also going to matter when it comes to policy. So this cartoon illustrates, I think, really well something that I found in my own research, which is that more than half of Americans think China owns the vast majority of US debt. It does not. It actually owns about 8%. But this misperception has, strong effects on their attitudes. So people who hold this misperception are much more concerned about our national debt, prioritize paying it down, etc. But what I also find is that, again, partially because this hasn't been politicized in the way that candidate misinformation is, these types of misperceptions about policy are much more correctable. So when I correct misperceptions about China debt, the corrections stick, even for months at a time. So I'm going to close by offering some bad news and some good news, and I'll start with the bad news. So again, motivated reasoning, and we all know this means that a lot of misinformation is really hard to correct, and we've all experienced this, trying to argue with our crazy liberal or crazy conservative uncle, right? It's always an uncle, that it's very difficult to correct people when they're set in their views, and this is especially true when it comes to Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, right? The kind of marquee political people. And the existence of belief echoes means that even when you correct the information, even when people believe the corrections, it can still exert these effects on attitudes. But the good news, the other side of the motivated reasoning coin is that a lot of this information doesn't actually change people's minds. They just are, they're using it to reinforce their pre-existing attitudes. And second, the corrections can work, especially when you get into issues that are not as partisan. Down ballot races, policy issues, right? When you start moving away from Trump and Clinton, corrections become a lot more effective. So again, to sum up, I think whenever we are talking about designing interventions to correct misinformation, it's really important to ask the question, when does misinformation actually matter? Thank you.